All the way back in 2018, Apple released 3 new iPhones, the iPhone XS and XS Max as their major flagships starting at $1,000, along with the all-new iPhone XR starting at $750. The XR was unlike any iPhone before it, with perhaps the exception of the plastic 2013 5C. It offered a variety of colors and mixed the new notched and home button-less design with the LCD screen of old. All this made for a phone that was incredibly popular, and for good reason. It was surprisingly fair value, having almost the same specs as the XS itself, with even a couple benefits like the size and better battery life to boot. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and the iPhone XR turns 6 years old in 2024. Despite the age, however, it is able to run iOS 18, of which right now I'm using the beta version, with the full release coming this fall 2024. This means we're looking at another full year of software updates, and while it's unlikely iOS 19 hits the device, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. Either way, we're looking at a phone that has managed to age about as gracefully as any smartphone possibly can. It doesn't feel particularly slow, at least to me, and this is with a fairly early beta version of iOS 18 again. It can run practically any app and do practically anything that even the current Pro iPhones can do, just in a much more humble and technically older package. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of newer devices, and it does stand as the oldest iPhone still receiving support, along with the XS and XS Max. But 6 years later, the XR holds up far better than I think anyone would have ever expected, and so today we're going to talk about how it performs, whether or not you should upgrade if you currently have one, and finally, if it could even be worth purchasing on the used market as a budget iPhone option. Let's start this with, as I often like to do with these sorts of reviews, the XR's overall status in 2024, and by extension 2025 as well, and whether or not it's even usable. As already implied, it is, but the big elephant in the room with any older smartphone is always going to be the battery. If you have poor battery health, the experience is going to be rough. You can check your battery health under Settings, Battery, then Battery Health. Once you're near and under 80%, you're going to really notice poor performance comparatively to how it used to be, both in how long you can hold a charge, as well as potentially the speeds of the phone itself. There will be a pop-up at some point telling you should get your battery serviced, and Apple can install a brand new battery for a fee. This isn't the worst idea to breathe new life into your phone, but many people with a phone that's this old may just prefer to upgrade altogether and move on, and that's a very fair perspective. It's something to keep an eye on, and it is very much important, as it can impact how your experience on the XR feels, and even if your battery is relatively healthy, you may still struggle to get a full day's use out of it depending on what you do and for how long you do it. Things like gaming or streaming video can drain the battery quite quickly, especially compared to just texting or even browsing social media. It's likely a good idea to keep a charger nearby if possible throughout the day, and while dealing with battery life being mediocre at best is kind of annoying, it's an inevitable reality for any older smartphone, especially one that's likely been used with some consistency over the past half-decade. Batteries do degrade, and even if you have a new battery, iOS updates can seemingly require more and more power than they ever did previously. The good news is, however, if you can live with the battery, either by more frequent charging or maybe fairly light usage, then the XR is a perfectly decent and usable smartphone 6 years later. There are downsides to be sure. It's not the fastest thing in the world, and slowdowns do tend to happen. The RAM is limited and apps won't stay open in the background as long as they would on a newer device. Things might feel at times a bit choppy, especially with more demanding apps and games. You also only have one single camera lens, something pretty rare on most iPhones these days aside from the SE. There is a lot lacking here in terms of bells and whistles, but the core experience of iOS is still going to be iOS. An iPhone 15 Pro Max might host a camera with quadruple the megapixel count, sure, along with a couple extra lenses, but the things you'll mostly be doing on your device day to day, often boiling down to media consumption, texting, calling, listening to music, web browsing, whatever it is you might be doing, these are things that don't actually really change device to device by any impactful measure. Sure, the XR might feel a bit slower, but it still runs perfectly fine enough, at least in my own experience, and it actually impressed me how well it seemed to be able to handle pretty much anything I threw at it. iOS 18 does have some lag for me, especially when first booting up the phone, but for the most part it seems to run just fine. Good enough, and the software certainly doesn't chug like it did with, say, iOS 9 on the iPhone 4S back in the day. It's more than usable, and being able to download and use any app with very few limitations makes that core experience not at all far removed from the best iPhones available today. It really just comes down to your level of tolerance with an older device like this. With all the drawbacks and quality quality of life features surrounding the battery, potential slowdowns, cameras, older display, and so on. But I think it all does pretty darn well for the most part, and for a 2018 smartphone over a half-decade later, it's very difficult to justifiably complain. Of course it's not fast anymore, of course the battery's not going to be great, of course there are issues, but it's 6 years old just about. And on eBay.com I was seeing the XR for about $100 to $150 US in varying conditions. That's not the worst price, and actually might represent surprisingly okay value for someone who just needs a phone for the basics, and one that is ideally running the latest version of iOS for at least another year. In summation, the XR, especially with good battery health, is still very usable today. If you're thinking about upgrading, I wouldn't blame you, and something like the iPhone 15 would definitely be a significantly better experience, particularly with that battery life. But I do think that if you can stomach some of the inconveniences of having an older smartphone, the XR might be able to last you just a little bit longer if you're okay with it. It always varies user to user, which makes these videos difficult to do. But this phone getting an extra year of support with iOS 18 is a really strong indication of it still holding up well in 2024 and even beyond. Let's back up a bit here and look at the phone itself a bit closer, starting with the design. A design we really haven't seen since 2019 with the iPhone 11. What makes the XR and the 11 stand out is their LCD Retina panels. These are 6.1-inch displays with a resolution that is notably lower than most smartphones at 1792 by 828, making for a pixel density of 326 pixels per inch. Looking at the XR compared to the XS, the OLED iPhones are visibly a bit sharper to my own eye, maybe not so much on camera, but as it's always been even since this phone came out in 2018, the display is more than good enough. Most users will not notice, or even more importantly, really care, that technically it has less pixels than a better iPhone. The XR's display looks fine, and the size of 6.1 inches is actually pretty ideal. It's a little larger than the smaller iPhone XS display, which is 5.8 inches, and originally cost $250 extra in 2018. The XR by modern standards is chunky with thick bezels, relatively speaking, but these are aspects I don't think most will care about. 6.1 inches is also the display size of the current smaller options for iPhones since the 12 and 12 Pro. I think it's a really good in-between option that doesn't feel too big, even despite the chunkier body, but certainly doesn't feel too small either, and it does allow for a bigger battery than a smaller phone would have. Actually, the iPhone XR, for what it's worth, always outperformed the XS and the XS Max in battery life when it came to most real-life use cases, in large part thanks to the lower-powered LCD screen, so this does bode well for anyone still using it today. The iPhone XR came with a wide variety of color options, the most we'd seen since the iPhone 5C, and it set it apart from most flagship smartphones at the time, with an aluminum frame and glass backing giving it still a very much premium feel in the hand. Side note, coral is still possibly my favorite iPhone color ever. My brother used this phone for a couple years and unfortunately cracked it, but it still manages to be gorgeous regardless, at least in my eyes. It is glass though, so you're probably going to want to use a case, which he did, and it still cracks. So, you know, things happen, but a case is always a good idea to help, as well as a screen protector. The curved sides make the phone quite comfortable to hold, and this design and feel is something Apple hasn't done on their newer iPhones since the 12 line. I always appreciate coming back to these older phones, these curved and non-sharp edges. They just feel good. I don't know if I truly prefer them, but they are nice and just different, certainly not in a bad way. And some people do still prefer this style of phone, even if something like the XR or the 11 are fairly chunky, as I keep saying. It's crazy how much phones have advanced and yet really haven't, because I mean, it all comes down to the core experience, and the XR really isn't that different from, say, even the 15 Pro Max. On the bottom of the phone, we have the Lightning port, which can allow for fast charging if you have the appropriate brick for it. We also have wireless charging thanks to the glass back, no MagSafe, and we of course have IP67 water resistance, so you don't need to worry about a quick drop into the sink or the toilet. Also, there's no 5G here, but 4G LTE is still plenty fast enough, so I wouldn't worry about it. Face ID here is as solid as ever and feels fast even coming from my 15 Pro Max. The XR's hardware is also fairly impressive given its age, thanks to it having the same chipset as the iPhone XS, the A12 processor, along with 3 gigs of RAM, whereas the XS does have 4 gigs of RAM, which might help with apps staying open in the background slightly longer and being overall just a little faster, but you'd be hard-pressed to notice any significant differences between the phones. And either way, their fates are inevitably tied together with the A12 chip. But basically, if the iPhone XS does somehow get iOS 19, the fall of 2025, which I really don't think will happen, but it could, then the XR would get it as well. Note that not having the latest version of iOS is by no means a death sentence, as it mainly means you're just missing out on the newest features. Apps on the App Store tend to support phones even a few versions behind, and past that, you can always download the latest compatible version of an app that you have downloaded before. Basically, I think it's more likely people's batteries will crap out on them before the software experience ever truly becomes obsolete. Storage might be a problem for some people depending on the type of user you are. The XR came in at 64, 128, and 256 gigabyte options. The 64 gig models will be the cheapest on a site like eBay if you're looking to buy one today, and while I do think it's a usable amount of space for most people, you likely will want to have an iCloud photo subscription if you take a lot of pictures and video. It's only a couple bucks a month and keeps all your pictures backed up on the cloud, which is honestly a really nice feature, and I'd recommend this for anyone regardless of how much space they still have. It ensures that if you lost your phone or it was stolen or destroyed, you wouldn't be losing all your data along with it. It's almost suspiciously good value from Apple, so hey, why not take advantage? But that's an aside. Let's talk about the camera, starting with the 7 megapixel selfie camera, which is mediocre by modern standards, but does the job. It does take selfies. The rear wide lens is more interesting, being the main sensor that came on the iPhone XS, offering 12 megapixels and the ability to record video in 4K at up to 60 frames per second. The XR can take nice photos in the right conditions, with ideal lighting, preferably outdoors during the day. Go indoors, or even dare to take photos at night or in the dark, and you will start to notice graininess, potentially more blurriness, and just sort of mediocrity in general with your results. But it still does the job good enough, I think, to hopefully capture moments and memories, which is the purpose of a camera at the end of the day, regardless of the megapixel count. The iPhone 11 and 11 Pro did see a pretty significant upgrade to the camera systems, with the base 11 actually getting a second lens on the back with the ultra-wide, as well as a night mode, which did improve low-light pictures by a fair margin. That being said, even the 11 and 11 Pro are pretty old now as well, and if you're getting an older phone or already have one, you probably just don't care that much about the lower quality cameras. If you do, a modern iPhone, potentially even the Pro, would be the device to go for, but considering the XR can be found for like 150 bucks, even less than that, the pictures are honestly pretty impressive and roughly on par with like the iPhone SE 3rd generation. It is one of those big features you'll feel like is a real upgrade if you go to something like the iPhone 15 coming from the XR, along with especially battery life, but ultimately it's something a lot of people just aren't too worried about, and that's completely justified. Managing expectations with a 6-year-old smartphone is just something you'll have to do if you have one, but that doesn't mean you're getting a poor experience. The important thing for a lot of people is just that it gets the job done. Up until a couple years ago, my grandfather was using an iPhone 5S still, and the photos from that thing were not very good, but you know what? He didn't care because it was still taking pictures he wanted to take, and that's all that really mattered to him. The iPhone XR in 2024, or even 2025, certainly does have the potential to be a poor experience, don't get me wrong. Bad battery health can very much slow down your phone, and even if you turn off the setting that actually throttles your phone once the battery needs replaced, you'll likely be looking at inconsistent random shutdowns and performance as a whole. You know that whole thing when you're at 60% battery life and then 5 minutes later your phone just dies on you? These are the sorts of things that can happen with an older smartphone that's been used a good few years, never mind over a half decade. But in any case, if you've got a healthy battery, I don't think you're gonna have too much trouble. At worst, you could keep a charger nearby or have a portable battery or a battery case even. These are the types of options worth considering. iOS 18 runs fine. Not amazingly, but fine, and keep in mind I am still on a very early beta version, so again it comes down to managing expectations with a 6-year-old device, right? And as said earlier, when you boil it down, the iPhone XR does offer the vast majority of the functionality that something like an iPhone 15 Pro is capable of. Same goes for the 16 Pro once it's out. All things considered, it's really hard to ask for more. And if you're in a boat where you desperately need a new iPhone and want to be fully up to date, the XR on eBay.com or perhaps something like Facebook Marketplace may not be the worst value. Although make sure you look around for a deal, don't just buy the first thing you see, get from a reputable seller or check out the phone yourself, and please try to make sure the device has a healthy battery to save yourself some headaches later, ideally close to 90% at minimum, since you're probably going to be using the phone for at least a year and it is going to drop over time as it's, well, used. Having said that, I don't actually recommend buying the iPhone XR in 2024, and certainly not in the future either. Not because it's a bad phone, but the iPhone 11 isn't that much more if you're looking at the used market, and it's likely to get some extra software support, be a bit faster, and have a significantly better camera setup. The XR has held up well, but the 11 was a pretty impressive jump for only being a single year newer, so it might be worth looking at, or even better, and more ideally, you go for something far newer that'll provide strong battery life and multiple years of usage without any problems or inconveniences. Not everyone can afford something like the iPhone 15, of course, but looking at even an older Pro iPhone, like the 13 13 Pro used might be worth doing if you're looking to get a more premium iPhone while still saving cash over buying something new. Something like the 13 Pro or even the iPhone 13, even though they're a little bit older now, are still really good phones and not at all far removed from the current models being sold. I mean, the 13 itself, as of making this video, is still being sold. Just avoid the iPhone SE unless you're buying it used. $430 for the SE3 is absurdly stupid. If you're on the iPhone XR right now and it's working for you, then hey, get as much life out of that thing as you can, right? Why not? And if you feel like it's just a headache at this point, maybe look to upgrade. I'll have my iPhone buying guide linked in the description below if you're curious. So either way, I'm happy to say the XR is still very much usable today, and it getting iOS 18 is an impressive milestone to be sure. Any of you currently using the iPhone XR? Are you thinking about upgrading? How's it working for you? Make sure you leave a comment down below, both for myself as well as anyone curious about how the XR is performing. Maybe they want one for themselves or they already have one. Just very interested to hear what you all have to say, because ultimately I'm just a reviewer. I use the phone for a little bit, but it's the actual users who have to use it month in, month out that are going to have the best impression of what the device is really like. If you found this video interesting or helpful, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. Huge shout out to the channel members. You guys are the absolute best. Without further ado, thank you so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.